Hey everybody, Gromlos here with another Warthunder Simulator battle video. So, there are two things I want to discuss and take a look at in this video, both related to the Enduring Confrontation game mode, with some footage from the two recent Enduring Confrontation tests in the background. First, historical matchups in EC mode, and my opinion of why EC mode is the best chance to finally get historic matchups in simulator battles, like many always wanted. And the second thing I want to talk about is simulator battle ground forces in Enduring Confrontation mode. I play both planes and tanks, and while I think Enduring Confrontation mode is a great way to improve simulator battle air games, I think simulator battle ground forces might need the improvement even more, since there are several problems with the current implementation of simulator battle ground forces in my opinion. Though it would be more complex to introduce the mode for tanks than it is for airplanes in my opinion as well. Now, I have talked about this before, but I want to go into a little bit more detail, and what problems there might be and how to solve them. But first, let's talk about historic matchups in Enduring Confrontation mode. Now, we had two Enduring Confrontation tests last week, one on Friday with the battle rating system, as we have seen in the tests before that. If you don't know, that means we had, for example, a battle rating range from 2.3 to 4.3. You could bring every plane in this battle rating range. The lower ones you could take right away, but the higher ones are on a timer, so you have to play a little bit till you can take them. The higher battle rating of a plane, the longer the timer, about 30 minutes for a 4.3 plane in this case, as this is the highest battle rating you can take. But you can decrease that timer by earning points. If you lose the plane, the timer for it and other similar planes at the same battle rating you might have brought resets, so you can't just fly the highest battle rating plane in the lineup all the time. Now, one of the biggest problems many people, including myself, had with this system is that it still used the battle rating system to determine which planes will face each other, and that still led to some rather weird matchups. Now, on Saturday though, we got a second Enduring Confrontation test, and this time with a historic matchup from the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, and we got the proper planes for it. So, instead of the battle rating deciding what planes you are allowed to bring, you had a list of planes that took part in the Battle of Stalingrad in that time frame, and you could pick whatever planes you wanted from that list for your lineup, assuming you own them, of course. The highest one for the USSR team being the LA-5, and for the German team the Bf-109F4 and G2. Otherwise it worked like the previous Enduring Confrontation test. And this is something I'm very excited about, because one of the things that excited me the most about the new Enduring Confrontation game mode is the potential to introduce a new historical matchmaking in simulator battles to replace the unpopular pure battle rating based one, at least in Enduring Confrontation mode, so I am very happy to see a test go in that very direction. Especially after we have heard for so long that historic matchmaking will not happen in Warthunder. Always with the same argument, it would not be balanced. Just recently we had a Q&A with Dodays, and after being asked again about historic matchmaking, he again said it would not happen, because MA262 vs B47 Thunderbolt, the same old argument we get since 3 years. Here's the thing though, this argument does not work anymore in the Enduring Confrontation game mode, if EC mode is done right, that is. This, oh, we can't do historic matchups because the MA262 vs Thunderbolts and Mustangs argument only works in a purely tiering-based matchmaking, like we have in Warthunder, but not just here. World of Tanks, for example, has the same thing, as a matter of fact started it. There are two problems we have with battle ratings in Warthunder. One, and this is the one I and others have most focused on in the past, are the battle ratings itself. Should this plane be this low or should it be this high, and the flaws in how this is determined. However, there's a second problem, and a bigger one. And that is the question if this steering-based system is such a good idea overall, no matter if the battle ratings are any good or not. I've thought about this a bit, and the conclusion I have come to is, if you want a historic matchup, a tiering-based system does not work very well, even less with tanks but also with aircraft, even if all the questionable battle ratings would be fixed. And that is because in a tiering system like we have in Warthunder or World of Tanks, the tiering or battle rating of a vehicle has to do two jobs: place the vehicle in comparison to others in the tech tree and produce balance at the same time. But that means that the placement of the vehicle inside the tech tree is the only tool for balance this system has. So, if a plane or a tank just happens to be stronger or more advanced than contemporary planes or tanks like the MA262, the Tiger or the KV-1 earlier, the only way for the system like this to balance this out is to move them higher up in the tech tree, sacrificing historic accuracy and, with it, for many players like myself, immersion. The difference with the enduring confrontation system, if done right, is that balancing and placement of vehicle can be adjusted separately. As far as placement goes, you simply have every vehicle available that was available at a certain battle, like Stalingrad in the recent test, or simply time frame. I don't think historic EC mode has to necessarily portray a certain battle every time. It can also, for example, simply portray the Western Front in 1944, with all planes available that were available at the time. And yes, that includes the MA262. But in the enduring confrontation mode, you have other tools than the placement of the plane to provide balance. For one, the timer. If the timer represents the combat power of the vehicle within the lineup instead of the battle rating, a 260 would have a very long timer, so it would be very rare. Even on Friday's test, high-end planes with the 30-minute timer were not all that common, and if a player is not careful with it and loses it, he won't be able to bring it again for some time. A MA262 would have an even longer timer than those 30 minutes in a 1944 setup. Unlikely a player would be able to bring this plane out more than once in a session unless he really plays for a very long time. On top of that, killing a plane of lower combat performance should bring less points for the team than bringing down one with a higher combat performance. That way, if it takes a few prop planes to bring down the MA262, it would not matter for the points of the team. So you can have a proper historic matchups for the 1944 Western Front with all the planes that took part in it. And yes, occasionally one Mustang would run into a MA262, as it would have been possible in reality as well. But if shooting down such a MA262 brings accordingly more points, while shooting down a Mustang in a MA262 brings less, the pilot of said 260 would still have to be good to be a positive influence on his team instead of a negative one. After all, as we know from the Swallows event, for example, even MA262 is an easy target when flown incorrectly, as is the case with many planes whose main advantage over their opposition is speed. There's no reason to put in B-80s that have no place in this matchup as a counter to the MA262, like it would most likely turn out in a pure tiering-based system like we have in Warthunder currently. You can use the EC timer, as well as points earned for destruction of the vehicle, to balance the matchup. You don't have to use the placement of vehicles in the tech tree to do it, as it is done in a tiering system. And therefore you can create historic matchups in Simulator Battle Enduring Confrontation to replace the battle rating Enduring Confrontation we tested earlier. There are of course different ways of doing that. My personal idea would be to have specific battles like Stalingrad right now for events, and for the normal EC mode use states. So for example one pre-war for early planes, one 1939 to 1940 combined for early war, and one 41 and 1942 one 1943 and one 1944 and 1945 for late war. And of course divided in Western Front, Eastern Front and Pacific War respectively, just as an example, and just make all planes that were used at the time available at the correct time and adjust their timer and points gained for the destruction by the combat power of said aircraft at that time. So the BF-109E7, which we get in 1.53, for example in the 1939 to 1940 time frame, would have a high timer, with this late E model showing up at the end of 1940. If you play in a 1942 time frame instead, you could still use the BF-109E7, the E was in service throughout the war, but there it would already have a lower timer, so you could take it faster, and in 43 it could be taken right away, for example. That's for the World War II years. After the war there could be a fictional 46 to 47 extended World War II time frame for superprops that did not saw service in World War II anymore, as well as provide a time frame where the MA262 and other early jets could be used with a lower or no timer, and after that a Cold War setup for Korean warrior jets and the like. Now, There might be concerns that there are not enough players to have all those different matchups at the same time, but I do think that a proper historic setup in a working and finished enduring confrontation mode will increase the player numbers in simulator battles and bring many people that left back into the game. If there are not enough right away, we could at first start with a rotation similar to what we already have in simulator battles. So that is a bit of an explanation of why I am excited about the Enduring Confrontation historic matchup test and what hopes I have for its future. Now, that test was apparently somewhat short notice, so not all the Enduring Confrontation systems worked right. Specifically, the timers were still decided by battle ratings, which leads to timers being very short to non-existent in the test. Something that needs to be addressed, but understandable since the test was apparently very short notice. Other than that, the historic matchup test was great. The matchup worked great and all the games I was in were very close. Closer than those I was in the day before in the battle rating based Enduring Confrontation test. The only problem that was often pointed out from a historic point of view was the fact that the B40922 we have in game right now is running 1943 engine settings and it should therefore not be in a 1942 lineup. But those are small issues that can easily be addressed. I had a great time in the historic matches, and so did many others. I hope with all the positive feedback Gaijin is continuing to develop the simulator battle EC along this path. And I also hope that they at least consider starting to work on the ground forces version of EC as well, because as I have said at the start, I think the simulator battle ground forces need some improvements, maybe even more so than the air battles. Now, almost a year ago we had a few very positive changes to simulator battleground forces with the first appearance of what was called the Absolute Simulator Mode or ASB events, which removed the name tags and minimap icons from simulator battleground forces. A change many were hoping for since a long time, and the events were therefore received extremely positively. So much so that you can see the increase in player numbers at the time the ASB events were going on clearly on the Steam charts. But even though the original experimental events were received extremely positively, the actual introduction of the changes into the game also brought a few disappointments. I, like many others at the time, assumed the ASB changes would, as they have proven successful, simply be introduced into the normal Ground Forces Simulator battle queue. This, however, was not the case. Instead, the Simulator Battle Ground Forces queue was, in a very controversial move, removed completely from the game, while the air one was moved to the Events tab. And the ASB events were simply introduced as events with 7 fixed lineups, one for every day. Now, there are quite a few problems with this. First of all, you are of course very limited in what you can play, which is also why in this video there might be some realistic Battleground Forces footage as well, since I, for example, can't play Simulator Battleground Forces on Saturday, as I don't own any of the tanks in that lineup. That, however, is in my opinion the smallest problem. Let's look, for example, at this lineup we get on Sunday. Now, as you can see here, on the German side there are quite a few vehicles to choose from. A few Panzer IVs, a Stück 3, Jagdpanzer IV, the Hetzer and the Tiger 1H. So quite a few different vehicles to choose from with different combat performances. So let's see how it looks in a battle. Well, I'm in a Tiger, the guy in front of me is in a Tiger, those 5 guys are all in Tigers, and hey, here's one who wants to special and is not sitting in a Tiger. And on the other side it looks similar with most T-34-85s and IS-1s. Well, the problem is well known. With a lineup like this, wherever it is historical or not, and the ones we're getting in simulator battles at the moment are most certainly not historical, with US and USSR teams always mixed, most people will sit in the biggest tank available in the lineup. And who can blame them? Why sit in an earlier tank if you can take a T-34-85 or an IS-1 and you know everybody on the other side is in a Tiger? And why take a Panzer IV if you can take a Tiger and you know everybody on the other side sits in a T-34-85 or an IS-1? On top of that, the lineups are always mixed, and with the exception of the one Cold War lineup, you always have both US and USSR tanks on the Allied side, and that is then called Simulator. Imagine the surprise of people trying Simulator ground forces the first time, expecting some realism, and then fighting T-34s together with Germans in the Normandy. On top of this, the lineups available are hardly ever balanced, in part because in simulator battle mode we sadly still have the old some tanks randomly get 2 respawn system from the closed beta. It did not work back then and has been ditched a long time ago in the other two game modes in Warthunder. Why it is still here in simulator battles I don't know, but for example the SU-100 and the Jagdpanther are on the same battle rating. The SU-100 can spawn twice, the Jagdpanther cannot. Why? Is it really better than a SU-100? Well, that can be argued about, but it is certainly not big enough of a difference to justify one tank being able to get in battle twice while the other cannot. The same problem with the SU-122. Or with the T-34-85 and the Tiger 1. Yes, the Tiger 1 is a heavy tank, the T-34-85 is a medium. Does this mean the T-34-85 is weaker in Warthunder than the Tiger 1? Well, having played both those tanks, I honestly doubt that. Back with the old penetration mechanics maybe, but now with the guns having more penetration overall while making sloping more important at the same time, the Tiger's armor is worth less than it used to be, the T-34's is more than it used to be. On top of that, the T-34-85 fires faster than the Tiger, why I don't know, is more mobile, turns its turret way faster and can fire almost immediately after stopping from full speed. I don't see it being any worse than the Tiger 1, yet in simulator battle it has two spawns, the Tiger 1 has not. So if you have one team with almost all Tigers, the other one with almost all T-34-85s, both tanks are of comparable power, yet one side can come twice, the other not, the outcome is going to be pretty clear right from the start. This whole system with giving some tanks two spawns and others not was a horrible system to begin with and has not gotten any better since the closed beta. That is why it was replaced ages ago in realistic battles. Only in simulator battles we are still stuck with it. So replacing the normal simulator battle queue with those problem-laden unrealistic fixed setups that nobody asked for effectively destroyed all the gains the original ASB events achieved. During the ASB events, Warthunder had the highest player numbers it ever had, according to the Steam charts. The removal of the normal simulator battle queue and reduction of simulator battle to a few bad event lineups put a stop to that, and the player numbers in simulator battle ground forces are falling ever since. So I think having just the normal queue back instead of those events would be better for the simulator battle ground forces, but of course there would still be a lot of problems. The uneven respawn just mentioned being only one of them. Most importantly, as I have said before, a tiering-based system like Warthunder battle rating system is just not suited for historical matchmaking. And there will always be a certain interest in historic matchmaking in a game like Warthunder. Otherwise, why use real vehicles in the first place? Now, for tanks, I feel the battle rating system is even less suited to produce any kind of historic matchmaking than is the case for airplanes, since you have different types and weight classes of tanks produced at the same time, workhorse tanks as well as specialized heavy vehicles, in a way that just rarely is the case with planes, the MA262 being one of the few exceptions. Let's take a look at the ECA Sherman for example. In Warthunder with a battle rating of 5.3 already often faced with a rather nasty opposition. The tank's production started in mid to late 1944 however, a few months after the production of such tanks like the Tiger II, the Jagdpanther and even the 7-ton Jagd Tiger. So if you would try to do historical accuracy just via the battle rating system, they should be on the same battle rating. Well, I don't have to tell you that this would not work like this, which is why the EC8 has a lower battle rating, lower than that of the 2-year-older Tiger 1, sacrificing historical matchups for balancing, just like it is done in World of Tanks as well, because, as I have said before, a tiering-based system like we currently have in Warthunder or World of Tanks just has no other option to do it. Another very good example would be the new PT-76 light tank we will get in 1.53. A Cold War era tank whose production started in 1951. I find it however doubtful that it will see too many other Cold War era tanks on the enemy team in Warthunder, because while the PT-76 is a Cold War era tank, it is also a terrible tank that sacrifices way too much for its ability to swim, and I don't know when it will actually be able to do that in Warthunder. Anyway, the PT-76 has a rather mediocre gun for a tank of its time, which I guess would be acceptable for a light tank, but it also has no armor, can be taken out by a burst of 50 caliber in the turret, is a huge target, and on top of that actually underpowered and quite slow for a light tank. It can swim, in reality at least, otherwise it's just bad. And the problem with this is, a tiering-based matchmaking system again can't deal with this in any other way but with reducing the battle rating of said bad vehicle. So I hope you're not going to be too surprised after 1.53 when you drive around in your Tiger or Panther in the Normandy and you start running into lots of PT-76s. Now, there have been suggestions to solve this. One that comes up often is different team sizes. As I have said in the past, I'm not a big fan of that, and I know a few examples where that actually worked, but many where it did not. World of Tanks tried it in their historic battles and it failed miserably. To get back to our EC8 Sherman vs Tiger II example, the matchmaker would need way more Shermans than Tiger IIs to get the game going, but most people want to play the bigger tank, even if you give them incentives to do otherwise. So 80% of the people will queue up in Tiger IIs and co, almost nobody in Shermans. No match happens. On top of that, and even more importantly, such a matchup, even if it would happen, would still be unrealistic as well as unfair towards the Sherman crews, because they would face almost exclusively better tanks and no equal or weaker ones. Now, some might argue, well, that's historical accuracy, that's how it was in reality. Well, was it really? Now, our EC8 Sherman's production started in late 1944. So to get an idea, a basic one, not an exact one, of what our Sherman was likely to meet in combat, let's take a look of what tanks the Germans produced in 1944, specifically the relation of so-called big cats to normal tanks and assault guns. So let's take a look at the big cats. In 1944, the Germans produced roughly 623 Tiger Is, 377 Tiger IIs, 166 Jagd Panthers, 16 Jagd Tigers, and the only one produced in significant numbers, 3,750 Panthers, for a total of 4,932 big cats. Now let's compare it to the more average tanks. Here we have 3,126 Panzer IVs in the version H and J, 4,486 Stück 3 and the similar Stück 4, 903 Stu 42, 1457 of the Little Hetzer, 796 Jagdpanzer 4, 308 Marder 3, and then the most dangerous of the bunch, 767 Jagdpanzer 470, for a total of 11,816 vehicles. And the difference in 1943 and before between normal and heavy vehicles was of course even bigger, and those vehicles are partially still around too. Now, this is of course not too accurate and does not take into account where those vehicles were going, for example, but it is just to give you a very basic idea of what a Sherman in late 1944 probably ran into when he ran into an enemy tank. And as you can see, it is more than twice as likely that he meets an equal or even weaker opponent instead of a big cat, and if he does meet a big cat, it is most of the time a Panther and rarely anything even bigger than that. So a system where the EC8 would face only Panthers and Tiger IIs, even if he has the numbers advantage, would hardly be fair. Nor would it be historical if you look at the Western Front at the time as a whole. Now, if you look at the vehicles we have on the screen now, you can see we have a very wide PR spread, from 7.7 to 3.0. So if you want to make a historical lineup from that time, how do you get all those vehicles in the same game? You could do it with a lineup like the current simulator battles are done, or events in the past. But then you would have the same problem we already have, everybody drives the best tank. And this is where Enduring Confrontation mode comes in. Here you can do such a historic lineup. Let's say we have a generic Western Front 1944 scenario. You can now put all those tanks we have on the screen in the lineup. On the US side you can put in pretty much all the Shermans, except the Jumbo with the 76mm cannon, since that one showed up in 45, the Hellcat, the M10, the M36 and so on, as well as AA vehicles and the like. Now, you will probably notice that in this case the US side has no counterpart to Tiger IIs, Jagd Panthers and so on, just like they had none in reality. And there's the thing that might be hard to accept for many. They don't need one. Not if a historic Enduring Confrontation mode is done right, because thanks to the timers they would be very rare. The more powerful they are, the more rare. And if you properly balance the points the teams receive for killing and losing tanks by how powerful they are, you can balance those bigger vehicles out. Of course, that is not just true when the Germans have bigger tanks. The other way around, early at the Eastern Front, where the Russians had T-34s and KV-1s, while the Germans only had early Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs, the same would be true the other way around. Now, some keep saying that the team that gets big tanks first would win, but why would that be the case? It's enduring confrontation mode, you can't just take 3 capture points and win, the game takes hours. So what if one guy or several guys on your team have a Tiger first? If he is not careful with it and he thinks the tank now makes him Rambo and he loses it without getting a lot done, he lost points for his team, because losing the Tiger will mean losing more points than killing 2 or 3 Shermans in it gains you. So yeah, they might be able to push an enemy back for a bit, but that alone won't win you the game, and when the tank is lost, the player can't bring him again anytime soon. Of course, that would also require the timer to be set up in such a way that it affects all the bigger tanks, so you can't just spawn in a Tiger 1, then a Yak Panther, then a Yak Tiger. Losing one of the big ones needs to reset the timer of all the big ones. But that is almost how it currently works already. Which means if you do bring out the powerful tank, you need to do accordingly well in it, or you will lose your team points, not gain them. So a better player in a Panzer IV has the same opportunity to do well for his team than one in a Tiger. For me, historic enduring confrontation mode is the way forward, and probably the only chance we will get to finally get tanks and planes in historic scenarios, instead of constantly having post-war tanks and planes fight World War II ones. Now, I know of course that enduring confrontation mode would be more complicated to introduce for ground forces than air, and I think most of the ground forces maps we currently have are not well suited for it. But I also think it would be well worth the effort of doing it, and might be the biggest leap forward for our simulated battles in Warthunder in years, and could bring a lot of players back into it as well as new ones into the game. There are problems like spawn camping to consider and solve, and I have some ideas for this already. However, this video is already longer than I planned, so I will get into that in a later video. Well, those are the reasons why I look forward to more historic enduring confrontation mode for planes, and why I think getting enduring confrontation mode tests for tanks going should be a higher priority in simulated battles than it seems to be the case right now. And well, this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was informative, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.